The snow had turned red before sunrise. It was December 20th, 1944, the heart of the Ardennes. The forest lay silent except for the muted thunder of distant guns. Somewhere between the shattered pines and the frozen fields, a single U.S. medic crawled through the smoke, dragging a canvas bag that clattered with empty morphine vials. Private First Class Daniel Reeves hadn't slept in 30 hours. The front had broken apart overnight, units scattered, radios dead, and 12 men left bleeding beyond the line. His orders were clear: no retrieval beyond enemy territory. But orders meant little when the snow itself whispered the sound of men dying. Ahead, through the fog, a faint cry. "Medic!" Rose and fell like a ghost. Reeves stopped, chest heaving. German patrols were rumored to be sweeping the woods. His compass pointed east, deeper behind enemy lines. He hesitated, knowing one step forward could mean court-martial, or worse. But then the cry came again, weaker, fading. Reeves gripped his kit tighter, swallowed the fear, and crawled toward the sound. The forbidden mission had begun. The winter of 1944 was the coldest Europe had seen in decades. Across the Ardennes forest, frost glazed the wrecks of tanks and bodies alike. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's desperate counteroffensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had shattered the calm of Allied lines. American units, stretched thin and confident after the liberation of France, suddenly found themselves encircled by German armor pushing west with ferocity unseen since 1940. Within that chaos, medics became the quiet backbone of survival. The U.S. Army Medical Department had trained them to stabilize and evacuate under fire, but no training prepared them for this. Frozen ground that refused to yield to shovels, convoys ambushed before dawn, and aid stations buried in shell fire. Private First Class Daniel Reeves served with the 28th Infantry Division, one of the units mauled near Bastogne in the early days of the German assault. His battalion aid post had been overrun 2 nights earlier. Supplies were lost, and the wounded scattered in the forest as the front lines collapsed. Reeves and 2 stretcher-bearers had escaped through the woods, only to find that 12 of their men were missing. Under standard procedure, medics were forbidden to cross the combat line without command authorization. The Geneva Convention offered them a unique protection, a red cross on their helmet and armband, marking them as non-combatants. But behind enemy lines, those symbols meant little. German patrols often shot first, suspecting medics of smuggling intelligence or weapons. In theory, the system was orderly. Field medics stabilized casualties, then evacuated them to battalion aid posts, then to clearing stations. But during the Battle of the Bulge, that system dissolved almost overnight. Roads were blocked, maps outdated, and weather grounded the evacuation planes. By mid-December, frontline medics had become their own hospitals, improvising with what little they had. Reeves had already lost 2 men that morning, one to shock, another to exposure. His own hands were cracked and raw, his bandages frozen stiff in their tin. Yet he kept moving, guided only by the faint memory of where the platoon had fallen. In the days leading up to this moment, chaos ruled the battlefield. The Germans had struck on December 16th, achieving total surprise. Thousands of American troops were cut off or captured within hours. For medics, the sudden reversal was devastating. They were no longer treating a retreating enemy. They were the ones retreating, often abandoning field stations filled with wounded. That sense of guilt followed Reeves. He remembered faces, names, promises made in whispers. "You'll make it, just hold on." But when orders came to withdraw, the wounded were left behind. Now, hearing the faint cries through the forest, he realized some of them were still alive. The forbidden part of his coming decision was not just military, it was moral. Regulations existed to preserve life strategically. Losing one medic could mean dozens more untended later. But the medics themselves lived by another creed, one that was never written in the manuals. If a man breathes, he's your patient. The region Reeves crawled into was part of the Somme River sector, a labyrinth of pine, mud, and frozen streams. German infantry had swept through it hours earlier, leaving behind pockets of Americans clinging to life in shell craters and ditches. Some were frostbitten, others unconscious. All were beyond the reach of official rescue. American command posts nearby were already overwhelmed. Radio contact with Reeves' company had been lost since dawn. He was technically alone. No chain of command, no backup, and no protection if captured. But among field medics, this wasn't unheard of. Historical records note numerous unofficial rescues during the Bulge. Instances where medics ignored orders to stay back and crossed into enemy territory to drag the wounded to safety. Some were decorated quietly afterward. Others reprimanded. That duality, heroism versus insubordination, defined the strange moral terrain of the Ardennes. Reeves didn't think of medals or consequences, only of the voices fading in the snow. He moved forward, keeping low, pressing his chest to the frozen ground. His breath turned to mist, merging with the gun smoke that hung heavy in the air. Every few meters he paused to listen. The forest replied with nothing but the occasional snap of a branch, or perhaps a bootstep not his own. Somewhere beyond that fog, 12 men waited, their fates balanced between war's cruelty and one medic's defiance, and as Reeves pressed deeper into enemy lines, history's quietest act of rebellion began to take shape. The frozen forest seemed endless. Every tree looked the same, black trunks streaked with snow, roots twisting like the bones of the dead beneath the ice. Reeves had learned to move in bursts, crawl 10 yards, stop, listen, wait. The only rhythm that mattered now was the heartbeat inside his chest. By midday, the weak winter sun struggled to pierce the clouds. It cast a gray light over a landscape that was half battlefield, half graveyard. In the distance, artillery thundered near St. Vith, and the dull echo of engines marked the German advance. For miles, American positions were collapsing under the weight of tanks and fog. Somewhere amid that chaos, 12 men from Reeves' platoon had been caught in an ambush. The last report mentioned a small farmstead near the tree line, used as a makeshift outpost before being overrun. If they had survived, it would be there. Reeves's battalion, the 109th Infantry, had once been confident. They'd fought through the Hurtgen forest, endured shelling, hunger, and cold. But nothing compared to the confusion of this counterattack. Entire companies disappeared overnight. Supply convoys wandered into enemy columns by mistake. Medics worked under near-constant bombardment, often without morphine, plasma, or stretchers. At Bastogne, surrounded units had already begun improvising medical care inside cellars and barns, using doors as operating tables and bayonets as scalpels. Reports filtered through command channels of men performing surgeries in frozen trenches with nothing but candlelight. It was these kinds of accounts that later inspired the stories of forbidden operations, unsanctioned, improvised, but vital. For Reeves, such stories weren't distant rumors. They were daily survival. The aid post he'd worked from the day before had been nothing more than a torn tent and a stack of ammunition boxes for tables. When shells hit nearby, the snow outside turned pink with mist. He'd treated burns with boiled water, fractures with torn blankets. Every wounded man looked the same under the ice, pale, shaking, eyes wide with disbelief. Now, as he neared the coordinates of the abandoned farmstead, the snow grew darker with debris, spent casings, boot prints, and blood trails frozen midstream. He found a rusted helmet pressed into the mud, its red cross half burned away. It could have belonged to another medic. Reeves stopped and looked around, listening again. Silence. Then, faintly, the crack of ice, not far away. He raised his head just enough to see the outline of the farmhouse, half collapsed, smoke curling from the roof. That was it, inside that ruin. 12 men were said to be trapped, left behind when their unit pulled back 2 days earlier. Some were likely dead already. But if even one still breathed, Reeves couldn't turn away. In later years, declassified medical logs would describe similar small unit incidents across the Ardennes, moments where medics defied orders and entered no man's land to retrieve wounded. Few names were recorded. Fewer still were officially recognized. But those who survived often spoke of one medic who came through the snow when no one else did. Reeves would become one of those ghosts, his story preserved only in fragmentary company records and letters from the men he saved. He reached the edge of the clearing and scanned the area. German soldiers were rumored to be patrolling these woods, securing crossroads for tanks moving west. Reeves knew that if he was seen, his medical insignia wouldn't save him. By December, German troops had begun, suspecting medics of espionage, especially after learning that American units often used medical litters to transport ammunition under the guise of rescue. Reeves slid down behind a fallen log, checked his supplies, 2 rolls of bandage, a few ampules of morphine, a surgical knife. His gloves were stiff with dried blood. It would have to be enough. When he finally approached the farmhouse, he did so on his belly. Through a crack in the wall, he saw movement, an arm, trembling, then a voice barely audible. "Doc?" He crawled inside. The scene that met him was beyond anything a field manual could prepare a man for. Bodies lay huddled in corners, some covered with coats, others still breathing shallowly. The air stank of blood and oil. A bullet-riddled door served as a table. One man had a leg wound already turning black from frostbite. Another, a chest wound still seeping through his bandage. 12 men, half-conscious, all behind enemy lines. Reeves took a deep breath and unpacked his bag. For the next 24 hours, the boundaries between soldier and surgeon, order and defiance, would blur into one unrecorded act of wartime compassion. The forbidden surgery that history would later remember, not by name, but by miracle. And as the medic began clearing a space on the farmhouse floor, the snow outside continued to fall, muffling the sound of artillery, but not the quiet heartbeat of 12 men clinging to life. At its core, this story isn't about war, it's about one man's refusal to let it define what is human. Reeves represents the kind of soldier whose battlefield was compassion itself. His hands, trembling from frostbite, still reached out to save others. He is not the hero who wins. He's the one who refuses to abandon. Every moment in that ruined farmhouse is an act of rebellion against apathy. While others fought to survive, Reeves fought to preserve dignity, stitching flesh, whispering prayers, trading his safety for their heartbeat. The forbidden surgery becomes more than a medical act. It's a quiet manifesto that even when rules break and nations collapse, humanity must not. From a strategic perspective, Reeves's decision borders on mutiny. He operates beyond orders, behind enemy lines, without authorization or communication. The Army manual forbade medics from re-entering captured zones. It risked intelligence leaks and medical losses that cripple morale. But in the frozen chaos of the Ardennes, lines between disobedience and duty blurred. Commanders could not track every pocket of resistance. Medics like Reeves became autonomous cells of mercy. His rescue mission, though unsanctioned, had ripple effects. Wounded men saved later returned to reorganize shattered platoons, re-establish radio contact, and stabilize sectors under assault. The Forbidden Act, therefore, becomes a symbol of tactical chaos, the moment when discipline collapses and only personal conscience fills the gap. Psychological angle, the weight of 12 heartbeats. In Reeves's mind, every sound is amplified, the snap of a twig, the rasp of a dying man, the echo of his own breathing. The snow is not just cold, it's alive, whispering fears. The boundary between duty and delusion begins to dissolve as exhaustion deepens. He stops seeing faces and starts hearing only numbers. 12 men, 12 pulses. Each one is a promise. The psychological burden of holding life and death inside his hands, with no morphine and no certainty of survival, warps time itself. Hours stretch into years. Afterward, even if he makes it back, he'll never return mentally. His mind will replay that farmhouse like a recurring nightmare. Blood steaming in the cold, bones cracking under pressure, the sound of scissors cutting through frozen cloth. The surgery doesn't just save men, it scars the medic forever. War demands obedience, but history remembers those who disobeyed for something higher. Reeves's decision to cross the invisible line into forbidden territory turns into a moral question sharper than any scalpel. When does following orders become wrong? His forbidden surgery stands at that paradox. The U.S. Army needed men who followed command, but the world needed men who followed conscience. Reeves never debated law or duty. He simply couldn't watch another man bleed into the snow. That was his rebellion. That was his faith. Philosophically, he becomes the embodiment of an ancient truth buried beneath every war. Compassion, not victory, defines civilization. In the darkest forests of human cruelty, mercy becomes resistance. The imagery of Reeves's story carries a haunting symbolism. White snow, purity, silence, peace, slowly turns crimson. Every droplet of blood becomes both a confession and a signature. For the soldiers who survived, that farmhouse turned into a sacred site, a symbol of life reclaimed from death. They would later describe the floor as a frozen altar, where one man's trembling hands performed miracles the manuals never taught. Even the Germans who stumbled upon the aftermath reportedly paused. Confused by the quiet, a room full of bandaged men and an American medic slumped against a wall, unconscious but alive. For a brief moment, the war itself seemed to hold its breath. The red snow became the color of defiance, not of nations, but of humanity. If captured on film, Reeves's story would not need dialogue. It would rely on silence, the heavy breath in cold air, the flicker of a lantern, the distant rumble of artillery. The camera would linger on his trembling hands, zooming out to the faint outlines of wounded men fading into darkness. The score would swell not at moments of victory, but when Reeves hesitates, when his eyes close before a final incision, when the lantern flickers out and only the heartbeat of one survivor remains. Cinematically, this is not a tale of battle, but of stillness within it. The power lies in restraint, the same restraint that Reeves lost when he chose to act against command. It's a scene that could belong to any century. One man, alone, refusing to let the world die quietly. December 17th, 1944, Bastogne frontline perimeter. The snowstorm thickened until sound itself felt buried. The forest around Bastogne had become a cathedral of white and silence, broken only by the dull thunder of distant German artillery. Within a shattered farmhouse under flickering lamplight, Sergeant James Reeves prepared to do the unthinkable. He wasn't a surgeon. He wasn't supposed to be there. And yet, 12 men lay before him. Broken bodies arranged on blood-soaked stretchers, their breaths shallow and uneven. The nearest field hospital had fallen. Communication lines were cut. Medics had been ordered to retreat to regrouping stations. But Reeves couldn't leave. The order echoed in his head like a curse. Fall back! Leave the wounded. He looked at the first man, Private Dolan, a bullet lodged just beneath the ribcage. Dolan's eyes met his, pleading, silent, afraid. Reeves knew the wound was mortal unless he acted immediately. He set his jaw and whispered, "You'll make it, soldier." Then, defying the radioed command, he began sterilizing his knife over a kerosene flame. The farmhouse smelled of blood and burned metal. Reeves's hands trembled, his breath clouding the freezing air. He tore strips from his own undershirt to bind the wound after the incision. He'd assisted surgeons before, never led one. But instinct took over. He made the first cut. Dolan screamed, biting down on a piece of leather. Reeves worked fast, hands steady now, his mind detached from fear. With no proper equipment, he used a field scalpel, tweezers, and the thin end of a flashlight battery as a retractor. Outside, artillery thundered. Each detonation rattled the lamp. Inside, the sound of steel against bone felt almost sacred. When the bullet finally came out, dull, silver, and warm, Reeves stared at it for a moment in disbelief. Then he threw it aside and moved to the next man. He worked like a machine possessed. A corporal with a shredded femoral artery, a lieutenant with shrapnel in his neck, another soldier whose arm had turned black with frostbite. He improvised, inventing new ways to save lives with almost nothing. A broken bayonet became a clamp. A whiskey flask became antiseptic. Snow packed in canvas cooled the bleeding. At one point the lantern died. He worked by the faint glow of a burning curtain, the fire crackling as if mocking the absurdity of it all. A man performing surgery in a war that no longer believed in rules. By dawn, Reeves had operated on 8 men. 4 more remained. His eyes were red, his gloves stiff with frozen blood. When he finally paused, he could hear his own heartbeat, fast, relentless, human. Then the sound. Boots crunching snow. Voices in German. Through the shattered window, Reeves saw them. A 6-man patrol, weapons slung casually, scanning the tree line. They were only 50 yards away. He turned down the lamp, his body trembling not from fear but exhaustion. The wounded men stirred. One groaned in pain. Reeves placed a hand over his mouth, whispering, "Quiet." "Please." The Germans paused. One pointed toward the farmhouse. Reeves reached for his pistol, then stopped. His hand hovered, shaking. He realized that firing would mean certain death for everyone. So instead, he made a choice that would echo in history. He went back to work. While the enemy patrol lingered outside, Reeves began his 9th surgery. He sliced into the wounded man's abdomen as the boots drew closer. Every heartbeat now a gunshot in his ears. The Germans peered inside, saw a man drenched in blood and motion, hands trembling over a dying soldier. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of them said quietly, "Arst, doctor." And they walked away. By the time the sun pierced through the broken roof, Reeves had finished. 12 men lived, barely. His hands were numb, his body swaying with fatigue. He collapsed against the wall, surrounded by bandaged soldiers breathing unevenly in the dim light. He had violated every military protocol, defied orders, used enemy territory as a hospital, risked capture and death. But as dawn broke over Bastogne, the forbidden surgery became legend. Later, when reinforcements arrived, they found the farmhouse silent. The snow outside stained red, the air thick with antiseptic and gunpowder. Reeves was barely conscious, whispering the same words over and over. "Don't tell command. Just tell them they lived." By midday, the sound of engines rolled through the valley, the deep growl of M3 half-tracks and jeeps breaking through the cold. Snow kicked up as the American relief column entered what was left of the Bastogne perimeter. Among them, medical officers, MPs, and a few stunned infantrymen who couldn't believe anyone was still alive there. Inside the farmhouse, Sergeant Reeves sat slumped against a wall, his uniform dark with blood that wasn't his own. The makeshift operating table was covered with cloth, steel fragments, and the unmistakable smell of death mixed with whiskey and ash. When Captain Nathan Harlow of the 101st Airborne stepped inside, he froze. The site looked more like a slaughterhouse than a field post, yet, against all odds, 12 men were breathing. Harlow turned to Reeves, his voice low. "Who did all this?" Reeves didn't answer. His eyes were glassy. His voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. "I couldn't leave them, sir." The medics took over. They carried the wounded out one by one, astonished to find that most had stable pulses. Reeves, barely able to stand, was ordered to be examined, but refused treatment until the last man had been evacuated. When word reached headquarters, confusion spread. An enlisted medic had performed multiple unauthorized surgeries, with no surgeon present, no command approval, and using improvised instruments. Some officers wanted him court-martialed immediately, but the testimonies from survivors began to emerge. "Reeves cut a bullet from my side when everyone else ran," one soldier told a reporter later. "He worked for hours. I thought he was crazy. Turns out he was the only sane man left. An internal inquiry was ordered. Reeves was summoned to appear before the battalion medical board within 48 hours. Still pale, still shaking, his hands bandaged from frostbite and burns. Inside a small command tent lit by lanterns, Reeves sat facing 3 officers and a surgeon major from the 10th Armored Division. The air smelled faintly of coffee and smoke. His uniform was clean now, but his eyes hadn't changed. Hollow, unwavering, the lead officer began, "Sergeant Reeves, you are aware that you violated direct withdrawal orders during active combat?" "Yes, sir." "And that you conducted medical procedures beyond your training and authorization?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Reeves looked up, slow, steady. "Because they were alive." The room fell silent. The surgeon major leaned forward. "Do you understand, Sergeant, that if any of those men had died under your knife, you could have faced execution for dereliction and unauthorized practice?" "I do, sir." "And you still chose to proceed?" Reeves nodded. "Sir, if I didn't, they'd already be dead." No one spoke for several seconds. Then the senior officer quietly closed his notebook and said, "This hearing is adjourned until further orders." The case divided the ranks. Half the officers saw a reckless act that undermined the chain of command. The other half saw raw heroism, a man who refused to let regulations bury humanity. Colonel McNulty, commanding officer of the 327th Glider Infantry, reportedly said, "Reeves broke protocol." But protocol doesn't breathe. Men do. Behind the scenes, the medical board deliberated for hours. They reviewed sketches of the farmhouse setup, the instruments used, and the survivors' recovery charts. Out of 12, 9 were expected to make full recoveries. 3 would live with permanent injury, but all credited Reeves for giving them a chance. Even the German patrol report, later recovered by intelligence, mentioned the incident indirectly. Small American aid station east of Bastogne. Medic performing operations. We did not engage. He was saving his wounded. We respected it. When the final decision arrived, Reeves was summoned once again. Snow still fell heavily that evening, muffling the sounds of distant artillery. The lead officer stood before him, expression unreadable. "Sergeant James Reeves, the board recognizes that your actions, while in violation of standing orders, resulted in the preservation of 12 American lives under extreme combat conditions. The board rules that disciplinary measures are unnecessary." A pause. Then the officer added quietly, "You're lucky the war needs men like you." Reeves was dismissed, not promoted, not decorated, but spared. His name vanished from most official reports. The incident was classified as a localized field act of emergency medical response. But to the men he saved, he wasn't just a medic. He was the line between memory and oblivion. When Reeves returned to duty, he didn't speak about the night again. He avoided recognition, refused interviews, and returned to the field with a small surgical kit that he carried until the end of the war. Those who served with him said he changed afterward, quieter, almost haunted. He no longer flinched at the sound of shells. He worked mechanically, but with an intensity that unnerved even veteran doctors. To some, he was a legend whispered over campfires. To others, a symbol of moral disobedience, proof that compassion could be an act of rebellion. And as the Battle of the Bulge raged on, the echoes of his forbidden surgery lingered, in the snow, the silence, and the breath of 12 men who shouldn't have survived. By early January 1945, Bastogne was officially secure. The German encirclement had been broken, and General Patton's Third Army had forced open the frozen arteries of supply. The siege of Bastogne entered the history books as one of the most brutal stands of the war, a triumph of endurance, grit and blind defiance. But for the medics who survived, it wasn't victory they remembered, it was the cost. In the makeshift aid stations, the smell of gangrene, burned flesh, and ether lingered long after the shooting stopped. Men were treated on blood-soaked snow, morphine supplies were gone, and bandages were made from torn uniforms. It was in this chaos that Sergeant James Reeves's story became known, not through the military press, but through whispers passed between soldiers. They spoke of a medic who refused orders, who cut bullets from men in candlelight, who, in March 1945, Reeves was reassigned to a rear-area medical unit near Frankfurt. His record listed him simply as combat medic, commendable field service. He performed minor surgeries, trained new medics, and avoided conversation about Bastogne entirely. He didn't ask for medals. None were offered. When the war ended, he returned home to Michigan, where he worked in a small county hospital under a different name, James R. Hanley. Few knew of his wartime service. To his colleagues, he was quiet but fiercely dedicated, often volunteering for the toughest shifts. It wasn't until 1952, when a reunion of 101st Airborne veterans took place in Chicago, that one of the survivors recognized him. They shook hands in silence. Reeves only said, "I did what anyone else would have done." But the man who'd been there with him, Corporal Hensley, later told reporters, no one else would have done what he did. Not in that cold, not under fire. There were quiet efforts to have him recognized. Several letters were sent to the War Department requesting a citation for valor, but without official documentation, and with Reeves himself refusing to testify, nothing came of it. In the end, the only record of his defiance was the memory carried by those 12 men, and a single unsigned field report found decades later in the National Archives. The report contained a line scrawled in pencil at the bottom. Actions were contrary to procedure but consistent with duty to humanity. No name. No signature, but those who knew believed it was Reeves's commander, Captain Harlow. By the late 1940s, the U.S. Army Medical Corps began quietly re-evaluating its combat protocols. Reports from the European theater, particularly from Bastogne, Monte Cassino, and the Hurtgen Forest, had shown a pattern. Medics and field surgeons were breaking rules to save lives. Improvised medicine had become the new reality of mechanized war. Among those unseen influences was the incident later nicknamed the farmhouse surgery. Though no official name was attached, the internal review written by Colonel Harlow circulated in training circles. It described a medic performing emergency operations in defiance of evacuation protocol, yet achieving statistically unprecedented survival rates. That, one paragraph, buried in a military medical digest, sparked a shift. By 1948, the Army introduced revised guidelines allowing medics to perform limited emergency surgical interventions when evacuation was impossible. It was the first formal acknowledgement that war's chaos required not only courage, but moral independence. Reeves never knew it. But the forbidden act that nearly ended his career became part of the foundation for modern battlefield triage. In 1950, as war broke out again, this time in Korea, Reeves's legacy unknowingly resurfaced. Young medics carried lightweight surgical kits modeled after late war improvisations. Field manuals now emphasized autonomy. When isolated, do what must be done. Lives outweigh regulation. In the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir, where temperatures matched those Reeves faced in Bastogne, similar stories emerged. Medics performing amputations in snowbanks, saving men from gangrene and shock. They were hailed as heroes, not violators. Behind that cultural change was the ghost of an unknown man who once cut into flesh by lamplight, surrounded by the enemy. The new generation of medics didn't know his name, but they lived his philosophy, that compassion wasn't bound by orders. In 1963, a war correspondent named Martin Walsh began researching untold stories of the Ardennes. While combing through archives at Carlisle Barracks, he stumbled across a fragment of a 1944 field report. Unauthorized surgical operations conducted under fire. All patients survived. Medic unaccounted for during formal review. Walsh spent months tracing unit rosters until one name kept appearing in indirect mentions: Reeves. James L. He eventually tracked him down at a county hospital in Michigan, still working as a night shift nurse. Walsh approached him for an interview. Reeves listened, silent, then said softly, "There's nothing to tell. I just didn't want them to die." The journalist published a short article titled "The Man Who Broke Orders to Save 12 Lives." It ran in a small veterans magazine and received little attention. Reeves never read it. He died 3 years later in 1966 of a heart attack while on duty. He was buried quietly with no military honors, his gravestone bearing only the words, "James L. Reeves, he served." Decades passed. Then, in 1991, a historian studying the evolution of battlefield medicine for a PBS documentary rediscovered Walsh's article. Intrigued, she tracked down 2 surviving soldiers from Reeves's surgery, both in their 70s. Their testimonies were detailed, consistent, and haunting. One of them, Lieutenant Rourke, said with tears in his eyes, "He didn't save us for medals or glory. He did it because he couldn't watch us die." The documentary, Medics of the Bulge, aired in 1993. For the first time, Reeves's name appeared publicly in connection with Bastogne. Letters poured in from across the country, from veterans, doctors, and even German soldiers' families who had witnessed American aid stations. The U.S. Army Medical Department Museum later included a small plaque titled "Unidentified Medic, Bastogne, 1944, prototype of the modern combat medic ethos." Reeves's story became a quiet symbol, not of defiance, but of moral clarity amid war's darkness. In military ethics courses today, his case is sometimes cited under autonomous medical judgment in combat, reminding students that rules, while vital, can never replace conscience. In 2002, the Army formally acknowledged that field medics during WW2 operated under extreme conditions where deviation from protocol saved lives. Reeves's name appeared in a footnote among dozens of others. No rank, no honors, just a name. But among those who study Bastogne, his legend lives larger than that. Historians now view his actions as the spiritual birth of the modern combat lifesaver. Soldiers trained to perform surgical tasks once reserved for doctors. Every tourniquet applied on the battlefield. Every emergency chest decompression done under fire. All traced back in spirit to a freezing farmhouse where one man refused to obey death. When the guns finally fell silent, the forest reclaimed its quiet. Snow covered the trenches like a shroud, and the echoes of screams were carried away by the wind. What remained was not victory or defeat, only the memory of what one man dared to do when no one was watching. They called it forbidden surgery. But for Daniel Reeves, it was never rebellion. It was instinct. Somewhere between duty and compassion, he crossed the invisible line that separates orders from humanity. He didn't see uniforms that day, only faces, pale, bloodless, afraid, and he chose to fight death with bare hands in the frozen dark. History rarely remembers medics. Their stories dissolve behind those of generals and battles. But once in a while, a name surfaces, whispered through the wards and field hospitals, of a man who broke the rules to keep others breathing. Reeves became that whisper. Long after the war, surgeons studied his field notes. Techniques improvised in panic became the foundation for emergency medicine protocols used decades later. No medals could capture that. No citation could translate the quiet courage of stitching a torn artery under shell fire, knowing the price of disobedience might come before dawn. In the end, Reeves didn't win the war. He didn't end it faster. But he reminded the world that war, even in its darkest hour, still depends on those who refuse to surrender their humanity. And somewhere, under the cold Belgian earth, the snow still falls gently over a place where one man's forbidden act became proof that mercy, too, can be a weapon.